Welcome back. In the next couple of these mini lectures, I want to turn to one of my favorite topics regarding France, and that is the history of French presidential elections. Because at first glance, it appears that French presidential elections are something like we have in the United States. We have American presidential elections. But French presidential elections are very different than they are in the United States. First of all, every single person who becomes president of France can claim that he was elected by a majority of the voters of France. Obviously, this is not something that is true in the United States. We have had the popular vote leader lose on 5 occasions in the Electoral College, and obviously this happened in the last election where Donald Trump won the presidential election, even though Hillary Clinton received nearly 3 million more popular votes. But it gets even worse than that in America, because there are a lot of elections where the popular vote winner wins the election, but in reality, far more people have voted against that person than for them. And this is even true of very great American presidents. For example, my favorite president of all time is Abraham Lincoln, but in his first election in 1860, only 39.8% of the voters voted for Mr. Lincoln, which means that over 60% of the voters in America voted against Mr. Lincoln. One of my favorite presidents of the last 25 years is Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, when he was first elected president, he only got 43% of the vote in his first election, and even in his re-election, he did not receive a majority of votes from the American people. So the French, in this respect, I think, give their president a much stronger mandate to govern. Every single French president who has ever been elected has received at least 50% of the vote, and you can see in your notes, I actually gave the vote totals of the 10 presidential elections. So the first overview is that French presidents always have a majority of the vote. That is true from time to time in American elections, but it's not always true. Second, if you take a look at French elections, like British elections, they tend to be very short. From the time that elections are announced until election day, it's usually 4 or 5 weeks. Compare that to the marathon that exists in American presidential elections, where it seems like this presidential election that's coming up this year has been going on perhaps for 2 years. The third difference, and there are a lot of them, is that in France, elections are on Sunday. No president has ever received a majority of the vote on the first round. And so in France, if no candidate receives a majority of the vote on the first round, there is an election 2 weeks later with only the top 2 contenders vying in the second round. Originally, when French presidents were running, they were running for an unbelievably lengthy term of office. Originally, when de Gaulle wrote his constitution, French presidents were elected for 7 years, and there were no term limits. Since 2000, that has been changed. Now French presidents have a 5-year term, and they are limited to 2 consecutive terms, meaning that once they serve 2 consecutive terms, they have to sit out at least for 1 election, and then they can come back and run again. And you notice once again a significant difference with American presidential elections, where an American president, if they are elected for 2 terms, they then are done for life. So French presidents have consecutive term limits, and American presidents have lifetime term limits. One last interesting distinction to me is that in order to be a presidential candidate in France, you have to be 23 years old. And I mentioned this one, I believe, earlier in the semester. Compare that to an American president that has to be 35. We have never elected a president in his 30s. And when Mr. Macron was elected president in France, he was in his 30s. He was 39 years old. Now, if you look through the data, and there's a lot of numbers in front of you, when I take a look at French presidential elections, there are two distinct trends that I want to point out to you very early on. And the first trend is, if you take a look at the first 6 of those 10 elections, so that would be the elections in 1965, 69, 74, 81, 88, and 95. That would be the first 6. You'll notice something quite interesting in those 6 elections, and that is the candidate who finished first on the first round only won 3 of those elections. The candidate who finished second on the first round also won 3 times. So in the first 6 presidential elections, it really did not matter if you finished first or second. You had a 50-50 chance to win that election. Now, since that 1995 election, there has been a very different dynamic. And that dynamic has been, in the last 4 presidential elections, the candidate who received the most votes in the first round went on to get a majority in the second round. So there have been 2 very different outcomes in these elections. In the earlier elections, there was no discernible difference between finishing first or second. And in the last 4 elections, the candidate finishing first has gone on to win every time. And I do have some strong opinions on why I believe that dynamic changed very dramatically. Now, one last overview before we get into these numbers that I want you to think about. And that is, when I talked about the United States, we've had a 2-party system for 150 plus years. Every single person who has been elected president since, I believe, 1852 has been a Democrat or a Republican. If you take a look at Great Britain, the 2 dominant political parties, the Conservatives and Labour, have dominated elections again for over a century. Now, in France, parties come and go, and here the politics of France, to me, are much more intriguing than Britain or the United States, because parties come and go, and parties are often associated with a particular individual. So, for example, Charles de Gaulle became the father of the Gaullists. When Giscard d'Estaing was elected, his followers were known as the Giscardians. Francois Mitterrand is seen as the embodiment of the socialist for many, many years, and of course even today. Imagine in either Britain or in the United States a new political party being created, and 1 year later the leader of that party becomes the president of the United States or the prime minister of Britain. It would be unthinkable. And so this makes, in my mind, French politics, and especially French presidential elections, quite intriguing. So let's dig in. You can take a look at your numbers. The very first election was in 1965. De Gaulle is up for election, and as you can see, in 1965, de Gaulle is running against Francois Mitterrand. I talked about that rivalry. These are the two stellar figures in French politics. De Gaulle in the first round wins 44 to 32. And if you look in the second round, de Gaulle goes on to win by a similar margin. In theory, the next election would not have been until 1972, but de Gaulle resigned in 1969. His premier was Pompidou, and as you can see, with the resignation of de Gaulle, Speaker Poor took over as the acting president for a couple of months. As you can see in your notes, Mr. Poor actually finished second to Pompidou. Pompidou ran as a Gaullist. He won very decisively on the first ballot, 44% to 23%. And what's interesting in this election is that Mr. Duclos, who was a communist, almost finished second. He had 21% of the vote. He refused to endorse the more centrist candidate, which is kind of intriguing, because you would think that if you are a party of the left, you would vote for a centrist rather than a conservative. But he said, well, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. So it's, there's really no discernible difference. I refuse to endorse. And of course, what makes this so intriguing is that usually that's the key to the election. It isn't necessarily who finishes first or second, but look at who finished third or fourth, for example. So if you have a conservative finish second, and the candidate who finished third and maybe the candidate who finished fourth are also conservatives, if they rally behind their candidate, it's very, very likely that a conservative might win. Likewise, if you have, say, a socialist as the leading candidate, if the communist candidate is third and throws his or her support behind the socialist, it's very likely that they will go on to win. And so one of the things that makes French elections really intriguing is that this really encourages electoral alliances. And so sometimes you'll have kind of an informal agreement between parties of the right or parties of the left that, look, if our party wins, you will support our party. If your party wins, we will endorse you. And so this creates a really interesting situation for voters, where voters understand that they can vote their heart on the first ballot. They can vote for an extremist party or for a candidate that they particularly like or is charismatic, because the voters of France understand that no one is going to win on the first ballot. And as a result, in this particular case, what that means is you can vote your heart on your first ballot, and then on the second round, or in the second round, you can vote your head. So for example, let's say that I live in Paris and I'm a communist. Well, on that first ballot, I can vote for the communist. I understand that the communist candidate probably does not have a realistic chance to win. And then in the second round, assuming that there will be a party, a mainstream candidate of the right, and a mainstream candidate of the left, let's say a socialist, well, I don't really want the socialist to win. That's why I voted communist. But in this particular case, a socialist is a far better alternative if I'm a communist. And likewise, if I'm a real conservative nationalist, I may vote for that candidate understanding they won't win, but then in the second round I can vote for a mainstream conservative, maybe a Gaullist, or maybe a Republican, which they used to call Giscardians. And so in that way, both extremists of the left and the right can vote their heart in the first round, in their head in the second. And it makes France very interesting.